Continuing How the Great Religions Began. Book 2. The Religions of China and Japan. Part 2. Taoism, the religion few can understand. And I understand that concept because certainly people have made it into some sort of thing like Deepak Chopra, who tries to sound profound, and largely it's just, I'm not sure if he can understand what he has to say sometimes. I mean, he does, more than your typical New Age guru just saying fluffy stuff, but anyways. Lao Tzu wrote, "To those who are good to me, I am good, and to those who are not good to me, I am good, and thus all get to be good." Part 1, or Section 1, I guess. The meeting of the two philosophers. At the time of Confucius, began spreading over China. Early in his career as a teacher, there was another philosopher whose name was upon the lips of many admirers. Confucius had heard of this philosopher called Lao Tzu, who lived in the city of Luoyang and worked there as a keeper of the archives in the imperial library. The teachings of Lao Tzu seemed very strange to Confucius, and later when he was invited to the imperial library to study the manuscripts of ancient Chinese music, Confucius sent word to Lao Tzu that he wished to meet him. After the messenger left, Confucius seated himself on a mat and began to read a manuscript written on bamboo slips. As he sat there studying, he heard someone coming into the room. He looked up and saw a bald-headed, long-bearded old man coming towards him. Confucius immediately rose to show due respect to his elder. "What are you reading, sir?" the old man asked. "The Book of the Changes," Confucius replied, realizing that the very old man before him was none other than Lao Tzu himself. Then he added, "The sages of old studied this book, I am told. For what purpose do you read it?" asked Lao Tzu. "The Book of Changes teaches about humanity and justice." "Humanity and justice?" Lao Tzu explained impatiently and began to pace the room. "Does the pigeon bathe itself all day to make itself white? It does not. It is naturally white, and so with people. If they are good and just at heart, you do not need to teach them justice." This began a long discussion between the two philosophers, Lao Tzu doing most of the talking. From time to time, he asked Confucius questions, to which Confucius replied very politely, "Why do you study so much about things that were done in the olden days? Of what interest and benefit is that to you?" Lao Tzu asked. "I believe," Confucius replied to the old man, "that people are born good, and that learning and knowledge will keep them good. But before we can have new knowledge, we must first know the old. That is why I think the wisdom of our forefathers should be studied carefully." This reply angered Lao Tzu. "The men of whom you speak, sir, together with their bones, have mouldered in the grave. Let go of your proud airs and your big plans to teach the world justice. All this is of no use to you. That is what I have to tell you, and that is all." Then he turned and left the room. Later, when Confucius returned to his followers, they all asked about his meeting with Lao Tzu and what he thought of him. Confucius thought for a while, then said, "I know how birds fly, how fish swim, and how animals run. And the runner may be snared, the swimmer may be hooked, and the flyer may be shot with an arrow. But there is the dragon. I cannot tell how it mounts on the wind through the clouds and rises to heaven. Today I have seen Lao Tzu, and I can only compare him to the dragon." The followers of Confucius understood from his reply that their master had been greatly impressed by Lao Tzu, whom he did not understand any more, and how the dragon goes to heaven. Who then was this greatly respected, angry old man, Lao Tzu, What did he teach? And what did we know about him? And remember, yeah, you can pick up some philosophy here and there, but it's the methods. Piling up a bunch of quotes, of philosophers. Of mere philosophers, it's better to live your life connected to the natural impulse. Section 2, what we know about Lao Tzu. In the village of Gaer, in the parish of Li, in the district of Tsao, there lived a poor man named Li. Li was very poor, but he was married. In the 3rd year of the 21st sovereign of the dynasty of Chao, which is really about 2594 years ago. I don't remember what year this book was made. This book's like 60-something years old. That's why it's brittle and falling apart. Li's wife gave birth to a boy whom they named Le Pe Yang. We know what little about Le Pe Yang's days, but we do know that at an early age he became keeper of the royal archives in the city called Luoyang, and keeper of the royal archives in Luoyang he remained for many years. His work in the Imperial Library gave Le Pe Yang an opportunity to study a great deal. When he later began to express his opinion on philosophy and religion, he gained the respect and admiration of many, who named him Lao Tzu, meaning the old philosopher. But fame did not change Lao Tzu's life. Keeper of the royal archives he was, and keeper of the royal archives he remained. In the imperial library, he might have stayed to the end of his long life, had not the rulers of his province become worse from day to day. When the rulers became so selfish and dishonorable that the old philosopher felt it was an insult to live under their rule, he decided to leave the place where he had lived almost all his life. He was 90 years old then, but he made up his mind to leave the royal library, leave Luoyang, and leave the province he had lived in, and that was his home, and he left. When he got as far as the border of the province, the guardian of the border recognized the old philosopher, and he would not let him pass. "Why will you not let me pass?" Lao Tzu asked. "Master, you are a great philosopher." The guardian of the border replied, excuse the sound while I straighten my footwear, "Your fame is known everywhere, and yet you have never written down your teachings. If you should leave us now, we would have not even a record of your teachings." "If I write down my teachings, will you let me pass?" Lao Tzu asked. "Yes, master." Lao Tzu sat down right there, and he wrote down the most important parts of his teachings. He wrote a little book, about 25 pages, which he named Tao-Te Ching. Tao-Te King. That's not how it's pronounced, I'm sure. Which might be translated to mean the Book of Reason and Virtue. This little book he gave to the guardian of the border, and he was then permitted to leave the province. Lao Tzu left, and it was never heard of again. This is all we know of the old philosopher. About Confucius, we know so many things. We know where he lived and how he died. We know where he lived and how he lived, and what he did all his life and how he did it. We even know what food he liked, how he received guests, and even how he slept. But of Lao Tzu, we know almost nothing. Even Confucius, we don't really know that as much as we think we do. When we place side by side what we know of Confucius and what we know of Lao Tse, they might be compared to two statues in an old museum. One statue, that of Confucius, stands right in the sunlight, where we can see it very clearly. But the second, that of Lao Tse, is like a statue that stands in a far dark corner, where it looks more like a shadow than anything real. The only proof we have that the shadowy Lao Tse was real is the little book, which he wrote at the age of 90, just before he disappeared. Many books, 10 times, 100 times as large as the Tao-Te Ching, were written in China and elsewhere, that have long been forgotten. Why, then, is this little book by Lao Tse remembered? What does this old philosophy teach us about his small book should have survived these many hundreds of years? And if I recall right, it's a rumored source of the Tao Te Ching is this. But generations went by and copies went by, and it likely contains some of the original. But we must remember a day when it may come to flee the governments that we were under the control of in order to preserve our reason, in order to preserve our virtues. Section 3. The Tao Te Ching. I think that's how it's pronounced. The Tao Te Ching is a little book, but it's packed full of thoughts. Some of these thoughts are easy to understand. Some of them are hard to understand, and some of them are impossible to understand. This begins with Lao Tse teaches that Tao is the great beginning of all things in the world, and that people who want to lead the good life must follow Tao. But what is this Tao? We are never clearly told. The word Tao gives all the translators a great deal of trouble. Some say it means the way. Others say it means the path. Some say it means reason. Some say it means the word. And some say it means God. Lao Tse tells us himself that we can never learn anything about his Tao if we do not already know all about it. They who know do not tell, and they who tell do not know, he wrote in his little book. If we do not know what Tao is, we can never learn anything about it from those who do know. And yet, it is this Tao about which we can never learn anything unless we know it already. That is the most important thing in life. Confucius, too, did not claim to know anything about God and heaven, but he taught that people should try to be good, and God would take care of himself. Lao Tse taught just the very opposite. He taught that the first duty of the people who want to lead a good life was to believe in Tao, the way, or God, I guess, depending on the context, maybe. And the world will take care of itself. Confucius taught that the people are born good. Lao Tse also taught that people are born good, but Confucius said that people can be kept good through being properly educated, whereas Lao Tse believed that it was not necessary for people to learn anything. Typically, education ends up corrupting, at least in part. They who know Tao are not very interested. They who know Tao are not very learned, he wrote. The very learned do not know Tao, which might mean that good people ought to be ignorant. This, of course, could not be exactly what the old philosopher meant, but just what he really meant by such sayings, it is hard to tell, and no one really knows. But beside these sayings that are not very clear, his little book also has some very clear and very good ideas. One of these is against war. The great object of the good man is to keep peace. He takes no pleasure in winning battles and in killing his fellow men. Not only is Lao Tse against killing people in war, He is even against killing criminals as a punishment for their crimes. But killing criminals, he said, people are not made any better, and crime is not done away with. The only way to make people good, he wrote, is by treating them with kindness at all times. So no monster factories for criminals, even if you do have to execute them. To those who are good to me, I'm good, he wrote in his little book, and to those who are not good to me, I'm also good. And thus all get to be good. To those who are sincere with me, I am sincere, and to those who are not sincere with me, I am sincere, and thus all come to be sincere. And later he wrote, a truly good man loves all men and hates none. These passages, easy to understand, are not many in his book. Most of the Tao-Te Ching is not very clear, and so, when we place side by side the teachings of Confucius and the teachings of Lao-Tse, we can again compare them to two statues in an old museum. The teachings of Confucius are in the light, and we can understand them very easy. He teaches that people ought not to worry about God in heaven and about life after death. Well, again, generations go by. They could have changed his message, because you can take part in both. You live a good life for the next life. That people are born good, and they ought to remain good as long as they live. A Muslim believes that everybody is born Muslim, and that they have ethnocentrism or polytheism or something imposed upon them. That's not right. And they ought to remain good as long as they live. That the way to remain good, the way to lead the good life, should be through knowledge, ancestor worship. Well, yeah, they imposed them back on Chinese culture. Loyalty of children to their parents, loyalty of citizens to their rulers, and above all things, justice. These things, Confucius, are all very clear to understand, but the teachings of the old philosopher are hidden in the shadows. We rarely know exactly what he means and what he wishes us to understand by what he says. Yet this little book became the foundation of a religion. This religion is called Taoism, which means the religion of the way, or the religion of God, and the sacred scripture of Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, the idols of Taoism. Again, idolatry and misassociation always pretty much creep up on any attempt to spiritually reform mankind. Supposing people were to find a book and open it to read, repay injury with kindness, repay evil with good, abracadabra, his puff but a piff, if people are hard to govern, it is because they are too wise. Fisk, lobster, short and long. And supposing the book were just full of such writings, one would think that people, finding such a book, would read those parts that had meaning. And if the parts were really good, they would remember them, and they would forget all the rest that had no meaning at all. Remember how people are with the Bible. They forget the parts that don't match up with modern society or their own personal taste, no matter how clear some of the other ones are. I myself didn't realize all the passages in the so-called New Testament that would put Christianity to shame. Just so, one would think, the followers of Lao Tse would have taken out the beautiful and good parts of the Tao Te Ching and would have forgotten all the rest. That is not what they did. They did the very opposite. That which is good and beautiful in the Tao Te Ching, they forgot. And those parts that made almost no meaning, the abracadabra parts, they remembered. Of course, abracadabra, I create as I speak. It definitely means something. But since no one can understand them, they set to work. They wrote long books explaining the meaning of those parts that had no meaning. Then came others after them, who wrote long books explaining the explanation. And their followers wrote explanations, explaining the explanations of the Tao Te Ching, until after 200 or 300 years, the followers of Taoism did not study the work of Lao Tse, but spent much time and energy studying the explanations that explained the explanations of the explainers who explained the first explanations of the Tao Te Ching. Sort of like an old joke of philosophers. Instead about philosophizing about stuff, how about we philosophize about philosophizing about stuff? That's brilliant. We're going to need our scrolls. And most of these dizzy explanations explain something that the old philosopher Lao Tse never thought of, never dreamt of, and never wrote about in his book. For instance, some explain that somewhere far away there was an island in the sea so wonderful that anyone setting foot on it would live forever and ever. And on that wonderful island there was a river, and anyone who bathed in that river would remain young forever and ever. Since these Taoists could not find that wonderful island and that wonderful river, they hoped to be able to invent a pill or medicine that would make people live forever and remain always young. So the goodness of the body and how to work the energy and change it and move with the energy, that's, what Taoism is known for. Including drugs, sometimes to use that. They also explain that anyone can understand the Tao Te Ching should have no difficulty in turning pig, iron, into gold and silver. We have seen before how the teachings of great men are often misunderstood and explained in the wrong way by their followers. Alchemy is not just a physical thing, although there are physical components of, the processes, and it could be physical in a different way. The iron of an out-of-shape person, the gold and silver of a fit person. Or, anyways. We have seen before how the teachings of great men are often misunderstood and explained in the wrong way by the followers. We have seen how Prince Gautama taught the Buddha taught his followers not to believe in idols, and later how they made an idol of the Buddha himself. We saw how Prince Mahavira taught his followers that there was no God whom people ought to worship, and later his followers made a sort of god of Mahavira along with 23 other Jainas. And remember, there's something going on there. There's different languages. The guy is saying don't worship the angels and the spirits and stuff like this. He might have not said anything against that. The Devis are not gods. But no great teacher of the past was so misunderstood and so wrongly explained as the old philosopher Lao Tse. Lao Tse, in that part of his little book that we can understand, taught people to live simply, to do away with war, and to follow the godly way. But his followers explained his ideas to mean that they ought to find some hidden secret as to how people could become young and live forever. About 500 years after the Tao Te Ching was written, one Taoist named Chang Taoling was said to have discovered a drink that would make people live forever. Immediately the Taoists began to worship him, and to this day his great-great-grandchildren are worshipped. Their leader, the descendant of the Chang Taoling, is called the Pearly Emperor, and he lives in the Dragon Tiger Mountains near Qiangxi and rules his followers with the power of a king. Besides the Pearly Emperor, the Taoists worship many idols. They worship dragons of every kind, and they worship rats, weasels, and snakes. They believe that if they carry certain ashes or certain stones or certain writings on them, then bullets cannot kill them, water cannot drown them, and fire cannot burn them. It could be in a different sense, but they don't understand, or he doesn't understand what they mean. As time went on, their beliefs in devils, demons, nixies, pixies, vampires, gnomes, goblins, and every other variety of evil spirit became very common. Millions of Taoists in China still believe in them. When they eat and when they drink, when they walk and when they rest, and in whatever they do, they think about these evil spirits who, they believe, are about everywhere to do them harm. Well, maybe they can tempt, maybe they can influence others to harm, but not directly as such.